Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show. We're more than honored to be sitting down today with Peter Spina, founder of goldseek.com and silverseek.com. You can see in the banners in the background. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today.
Hi, Justin. Thanks. It's great to be with you.
Pleasure's
Here
all
on a
mine.
nice sunny day.
Great. I'm glad that it's sunny there as well. I know that you are in Central Europe. Now, the headlines today are quite something. I think 10 years ago, we would have all been flabbergasted to be reading some of these, to know we would be reading some of these headlines. Talk of stagflation starting to creep into the media. I see, not the mainstream media, of course. Now, U.S. gasoline prices have set another new record. Peter Schiff says the Fed has already lost the inflation fight as the Fed announces tightening. The U.S. is facing a baby formula shortage. I saw this at Walmart. I was walking by that aisle, and there was a diminished option or menu of baby formulas, and just a litany of events taking place at the macroeconomic and geopolitical levels. Peter, what are you keeping an eye on?
There's a lot to keep an eye on right now. You mentioned, some very insignificant things there. Today, we just got the inflation data out, which was above expectations. And like you said, the Fed is losing control. They're losing control of the narrative. And that's one of the most important parts of inflation, because so much of it is built on the psychology, the trust. If people really understood what backed the U.S. dollar or any other pretty much fiat currency, it could really accelerate us into hyperinflation, into a total run out of fiat. But it's an interesting situation too, because we also have the U.S. dollar at 20-year highs relative to other fiat currencies, as we have 40-year highs in inflation. So there's a lot of things related to that we can talk about. But as far as the Fed, yes, they are. They talked about transitory inflation, and now, like you said, stagflation becomes a topic in media. Well, I think that's kind of like the step behind of what's really happening out there. Transitory was really high levels of inflation. Stagflation may be optimistic now. The high energy prices is a huge hit for the economy. We are seeing actual shortages for various reasons, but there are, there's some real disruptions out there, some real problems. There's real high inflation, and the Fed is way behind on raising rates. And they also are stuck, because we've talked about this for decades now, is this catch-22, where they have to either sacrifice the value of the dollar or the economy, because they cannot raise rates too aggressively without creating debt to start having imploding and other issues. So it's a very delicate balance. Psychology is a big aspect of this, and trying to manage these expectations is a big part of this game. So it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with this, and with high energy prices. And these other issues. These are issues beyond their control. And it's something that was stated by Fed Powell at the last FOMC meeting about a week or two ago. He said, we can't fix supply issues. China, Russia, these supply issues are real. We can only influence the demand side. So what they are doing now is, I think they're letting the air out of some of their bubbles that they've created, trying to reduce some of this excess liquidity really quickly now. And we're starting to see some real big sell-offs in different markets.
I guess we'll go with a prediction question first. Do you see these sell-offs continuing, or do you see this stabilizing anytime soon?
That's a tough one. I think we'll see more sell-offs. I think we'll see some big rallies. We may be at an inflection point short term here, where we see a huge rally. And as a gold investor, I can tell you, when you get into these periods where you think you're at a bottom in a key reversal point, and you get a huge rally, you go from very pessimistic to optimistic. And as a trader, you chase it, and investors start going back into it to only see another big fall happen, another fall, in the market. So it starts to cycle traders around. A lot of traders and investors will get kind of caught by these swings in emotions, and the market, I think, remains very volatile. I would be very careful. I believe a lot. We've had a huge amount of selling in the tech sector. Some of these stocks are just totally beaten down 80-90%. So there could be some huge bounces, but I wouldn't be really chasing them too much, because there is probably more downside in various asset classes and stocks do have a very high valuation out there. And companies are facing a real big problem with inflation too. The consumer's getting hit, and their costs are going up. They're dealing with all sorts of problems. So I don't think it's a great period to be in overvalued companies. It's too risky.
You mentioned energy prices, and I know that Europe is suffering from higher energy prices more so than the United States currently. Being on the ground there, can you speak to what it's like currently in Europe as it relates not only to energy prices, but I suppose generally as well?
Sure, it is a growing up in Colorado, where we've always had very cheap energy relative to Europe. I filled up at $7. Let's see, what would be about $7 to $8 a gallon, which is still going up. I saw it yesterday, up another about 2-3%. So it really hurts, especially emerging market countries who aren't as wealthy. So Eastern Europe, they're a lot more sensitive to inflation. So we saw the Czech central bank last year go from near 0% interest rates, and last week they did a surprise rate hike to 5.75%. And we've seen the real estate market go from a bubble to very, very ominous signs in the last month or so, where you have no real buying interest. 95% collapse in buying interest. You can see things really switch really quickly. So I think the emerging markets have been kind of a foretelling sign. It's an example of what's maybe coming to the West. Now, the energy side, the war, it's very real. Here in Eastern Central Europe, you're very close to Ukraine, and you see the impact humanitarian wise. The refugee crisis is a very big problem. Poland has millions of refugees. 20% of Warsaw now, the population, are Ukrainian refugees, and most of these are women and children. So it's a very big burden on these countries. They're trying very hard, but it's filling to capacity. And as this war drags on, that's a big problem. And and it creates division. There's a lot of solidarity at the moment here with the Ukrainians, but as this war drags on and the costs, there's a lot of cost associated with it. There's going to be some problems, and there's all sorts of there's all sorts of risks at play. There's a lot of this isn't your traditional proxy war that we've seen in other countries, and this is really Russia, not just versus the Ukraine. This is Russia versus the West, and we see the West direct involvement. You see a lot of the activity, military, Air Force flying around here. You see a lot of troop movement out to the eastern countries of NATO here, which we're right by. Boy, yeah, you really see what's happening, and it's very unsettling. And so this war is devastating on many fronts, and it has a lot of risks associated with it. Obviously, the energy crisis can get a lot worse very quickly, which leads to an actual energy shortage, scarcity. If they cut off the gas, they want to do it either voluntarily or transition in the coming years. The European Union is not a true union. It's very divided between the different countries, and you're seeing different countries saying, no, we're not going to stop buying gas from Russia because we can't, or our economies will collapse. Russia has them, they don't have the leverage to do some of the things they would like to do. Economically, this war started at a very precarious point in the economic cycle. Russia, I think Putin timed it in a way that they saw the cycles were changing and the largest vulnerabilities. So the energy crisis can get a lot worse. You can really see an economic depression come to Europe. They have a lot of different problems. There's a lot of debt, things that didn't get resolved in 2008. And energy is really the key driver in economics. It's if you're paying a lot more for energy out here, and there's true scarcity where you can't even actually run your factories, like having to shutting down a factory and not being able to produce, and boy, you have supply issues at the same time you have this inflation issue. So this is one of the most, I think this is the most dangerous situation we've seen in our lifetimes, because we are engaged in a direct warfare with a superpower. And it's escalating. And it's not just Russia. I believe China is playing along. They're playing along with their zero COVID policy, so on, quote unquote, by shutting down their supply chains and creating other problems there. Hey, it's complicated, and there's so many moving parts. There's so many geopolitical moving parts, and and you see things that should be making front pages, in the years past that are not even being mentioned. Is so there's so much at play, and it just seems to escalate. So the risk is really the key, I think, issue to focus on, and it's just growing in magnitudes, and the West is quite vulnerable. So I think it's time. One has to take protective measures, and I know that a lot of Americans feel disconnected from the Ukraine being so far away, but it has the war is fought on many different levels, and it's economic, financial, monetary. So it's not just isolated to the battlefield on their territory.
And that reminds me of the sanctions which took place, and you've seen how that's played out. The ruble collapse. You covered that in some of your social media posts, but then rebounded to its previous levels, if not higher. There was a lot of discussion about Russia by opening a gold window, but it was debated whether or not that was a true gold window, or if Russia was making a move to purchase gold at lower rates than the market. And ultimately, I think they raised the bid on that when the banks did not start selling gold to the Russian state in order to finance. And you mentioned Russia doesn't have as much leverage as perhaps the U.S. has over our lifetimes, as we've seen in these sort of foreign policy affairs. And I think in Russia, it probably won't be able to finance this as long as the U.S. can. It's got the world reserve currency, it's got the printing press. And historically, for centuries, we've seen in war that war would often stop until a king, for instance, could get a loan from the bank. You wrote on May 5th, Peter, the USA is an accessory to murder of Russian generals. The US is helping the Ukraine kill Russian generals with key secret intelligence information. The level of near direct confrontation now between the US and Russia is extremely intense. This is not your typical proxy war. I'm full agreement on that. It seems that we are barreling towards a true World War III scenario. And I guess, do you have more to say about how this is not a typical proxy war? Then perhaps we can consider some solutions.
I was trying to make a shocking statement to make people realize the severity of these actions, because it is the support. It was leaked by the New York Times. If this isn't indeed true, how is Ukraine taking out all these Russian generals? We saw maybe since World War II, the amount of generals killed, I think, was several or a dozen over all these different battles, and here we've lost dozens of Russian generals. So it's a serious loss and hit. Moskva, the Black Sea Fleet is getting taken out with these high precision, high tech Western supplied information and assistance, and it's it's a really it might be Ukraine hitting the final execution of the trigger, but it comes from the Russian perspective. What do they think? How are they seeing this? How does the rest of the world see this? It escalates things and put things on a different playing field. Does it make our generals does it put them on as targets in other proxy battles that the US is engaged with? Elon Musk made a comment that he's fearful he may unexpectedly die. Well, obviously he's working to support in a very strategic way the Ukrainian military. So he's part of the US military industrial complex. Like, does he become he thinks he's a target, the Russian media, and they're saying he's a target. So it's like, no, I think they would be pretty crazy to take him out because he's such a popular figurehead. But the problem is that the support with the average Russian is I don't know if this is going to work. I think from the West, they're trying to overthrow Putin and have this scare the command, and there's this big narrative to take Putin now. He's going to taken out. But his popularity has been rising internally, and I don't think these actions will accomplish that. And what are the consequences of that? And they become very dangerous, and the battlefield again, it keeps the risk, it keeps growing, and it's unprecedented. I never recall this happening in our lifetimes. This is something else. So it's a very dangerous, it's very dangerous. And I tried to just, put yourself in their shoes, how, not to say what they're doing is right or wrong, but what is happening, and trying to analyze the situation and what might come about from this. And how does the rest of the world see that? And you mentioned sanctions on the Russians. Half of their central bank, 300 some $1 billion was sanctioned, they confiscated in the West. How does China see their and other countries see their holdings in the United States? How does the rest of the world, how do they see the United States now? If you don't play along or do something wrong, you immediately become your assets get confiscated. So there, the way the rest of the world sees this, there's other there's some blowback from that too. So
We saw that the ruble moved 6% higher on May 3rd to 66.63 Russian rubles. Has that trend continued since then?
I think it weakened a little bit. They have leverage here, forcing energy buyers to convert into the ruble. So they've created this demand, and they've also tried to stabilize things with linking it to the gold price, like I mentioned there. But that was more internally for the banks, for the miners, and setting a rate. But trying to use gold to stabilize the ruble. The West was trying to impose these sanctions, and their hope was to destroy their currency and their economy. And they have taken a hit. It's not pretty there either. But the Russian mentality and the Russian approach to this kind of thing, they're willing to take a beating. Well, they may not be willing to, but they will be forced to take a beating. The public will, the citizens, the Russians are going to have a very difficult few years or more ahead. But the hope and intention is that they can try to take us down with them, try to ignite our highly leveraged debt, our highly leveraged financial system that's really just waiting at some point to face its day of reckoning. So I think that was kind of the point too with Putin. He didn't make this move into Ukraine expecting that the West was just going to do nothing. He knew this was going to be a very strong response. I don't know if he was expecting the amount of direct support and involvement maybe the U.S. is involved with on the military side, maybe not. But on the financial side, I think he fully, this was expected. He was accumulating a physical gold because it is, when it's in your hand, you can't confiscate it. Russia only had maybe $10 billion in cash and dollars. Otherwise, it's all just virtual. Can be cut off just like that. They can just take it away from you in their system and cut you off from their networks and financial payment networks. So this is a big point in our lifetimes. This is obviously it's pushing different people together: China, Russia, India. There's different shifts and powers and relationships, and it'd be interesting to see how this shakes out.
I've been thinking about, if I were a statesman, what sort of solutions I would be proposing to the situation in the Ukraine Russia war, which, as you stated, is not your typical proxy war, and very quickly, I think, increasingly becoming a direct in conflict between the U.S. and Russia. That just seems almost an inevitability at this point, unfortunately. And we've only seen the U.S. go from pretty escalated rhetoric to just even more escalated rhetoric. I saw in the Foreign Policy, which I believe is a journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, published recently, that essentially a general said that the United States should partake in Russia's zero-sum game. I suppose referring to Putin raising his nuclear weapons to I think second highest level, the next level essentially being ready to launch and solutions. So now there is an argument that you can't, I guess a critique leading up into World War II was that Chamberlain was appeasing Hitler as Hitler expanded, and that ultimately led to World War II. So there's a camp that says you can't appease Russia. We've seen intelligence agencies in the US argue that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union. And generally speaking, I haven't seen the evidence for that. Granted, I'm not an expert. He did make a comment in his speech on Victory Day in Europe, or in Russia, for what's called there the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and he said that the Russia's a multinational people now, but yeah, I'm not sure if he is looking to reestablish the Soviet Union in across NATO territory. That just seems like suicide.
Well, I think you look at how the Soviet Union collapsed and where Russia is today. They've collapsed. Their territory influence continues to be challenged. NATO continues to encroach on their borders. So again, from just a purely apolitical, just looking at it as objectively as one could, if you're in the United States and you see China establishing, putting in missiles into Mexico, having an agreement there, and you would feel threatened, as especially as a superpower out there. So I think Russia has made it clear that it's been a clear agreement that you're not supposed to put NATO on their borders. That didn't happen. And then the Ukraine revolution happened, where that government was overthrown by the revolution, by the color revolution, and that's a key strategic a country and territory and border to Russia. And then recently, we saw in Belarus attempt of a colored revolution again. And then in Kazakhstan, just recently, there was an unexpected one, and that failed. So I think the writing was pretty clear on the wall for Putin. It's you're from your standpoint, trying to even establish some sort of dominance on your border. You're not going to be a superpower if you're going to be surrounded by another superpower all your borders. So at some point you're going to have to try assert yourself, where you're just going to be another 10, 20 years from now, you're just marginalized. Russia is just totally marginalized. So it's understandable they want to be a superpower. So like it or not, that's what they're going to do. If you think you can take, put missiles right on his border and they'll be okay with that, I think it's more than a question of appeasement. It's the West. It got too aggressive. NATO got too aggressive, unfortunately. And what the right solution would have been to economically develop Ukraine, to help these guys out. After the 2014 revolution, color revolution, it took another collapse. I know the West had an opportunity to help build up the country. I was there in 2017, I believe, and it was chaos. It was chaotic. It was depressed. It just went backwards. And the country got more and more into debt from the IMF and other countries. And you have other problems going on there. Just the country is just a disaster. It's a mess. It's corrupt. Not that Russia does, what do they do to fully fix it either? But it's just, unfortunately for the Ukrainian people, they're vulnerable. They've become cannon fodder, I believe, for different interests, for the West's interests against Russia. In the end, I don't think they really, care about Ukrainians. They're in a strategic position, and it's about superpower and eventually trying to marginalize Russia. And the West has tried in the past, through Yeltsin, they tried to, the privatization schemes try to take big chunks of their huge resources. Russia's sitting on core of the world's resources, and they have a relatively small population, 150 million people, but look at their ability on the military front to be able to still defend and be on some level offensive maybe against the West. But we'll see here. I mean, they have a lot of, there's still a lot of work they need to do internally, but boy, I think a key to all of this is still how China plays out with this. And again, I believe China is pretty happy with what Russia is doing, and they have their own game going on too against the US.
Indeed. And you have covered China in your social media posts as well. You recently posted in regards to China that you wrote on April 27th, the West looks super vulnerable and not like a superpower. Daniel DiMartino Booth came on this show, and she mentioned that it appears that the US is in a state of stasis on the world stage as well. And that is a whole other topic, the end of the US empire. That's essentially what we're seeing here. It's unraveling, and there's a lot of implications there. And that kind of brings me back to solutions. But first, your comments on China. China can continue to strangle the inflation desperate West off with major supply chain issues and shortages, while Russia can come in for chokehold by limiting commodity resource exports to its Western partners. You also commented on China's zero virus policy. I'm trying to use different keywords here, but you mentioned that you didn't believe that was necessarily what was going on. Can you speak to your view on what is going on with the, let's say, leisure policies, the economic policies that we see in China right now, I think at port cities in particular?
Yes, well, Yeah, you got to go back to even when Trump was in power. We started off with this trade war. When President Xi came into power and became kind of took the country backwards and more aggressive stance and well, yeah, in the last few years with this whole COVID mess, China has been able, they're hurting as well through this COVID mess, but they have abilities to hurt us more. It was kind of my analogy before, like when Napoleon was coming after the Russians, they burned down. Russians were willing to burn down Moscow to kill off their enemy. It's like and the Russians in Ukraine and what they're doing to West are willing to take some big hits. Now, China, on that extreme level, they're doing things here, which it does hurt them as well, but they're making everything for us. The U.S. is a consumer empire. 2/3 or 3/4 of our economy is based on consumption, overconsumption, which is all brought to us by a very strong dollar, which China would like to have as well, their own empire where the rest of the world does all the hard work for them and they just buy stuff cheaply. And that's where they're trying to go. So it's a competition for superpower. And I don't think there's any doubt that China's on the upswing overall. Whether how many years or decades, does it do we have two superpowers, and eventually does China just come in and do we collapse internally from other problems, or what's happening? But China's on a trajectory. They have boy, they have the ability with their tyrannical government to force people into their homes and scare them, with different threats and shut down the economy and keep doing it, like we were seeing in the West as well on some level with the lockdowns. But the problem there is they've used this policy as a way to blame it on the COVID virus as a scapegoat. So here we have China shutting down, high inflation rate, shortages, commodity prices, shortages as well, depending with Russia here with energy and other issues, agriculture and other, inflation. It's just all these things at once. And we're just, we're a system built on leverage and debt. And we rely so much on our adversaries. And they know that, and China knows that, and they see what's happening with how the U.S. has acted in the last 20 years. And as an American, I'm not proud of it. I was against the Iraq War. I was against Afghanistan. I knew that was a trap. I went and protested the bombing of Serbia and Kosovo, and I'm very, war is horrible. It's really a last resort, and unfortunately, all superpowers, they use us as cannon fodder. But the U.S. has gone and done these things, and it's we've kind of lost the moral high ground there, and China also, they're rising superpower, and they want Taiwan back. They want to be, they're trying to establish their own superpower through the Silk Road Initiative and through these, through their other big projects. So it's interesting. I don't know if they'll go after Taiwan right away, but obviously if they went after Taiwan, they would have something like 90% control of the world's semiconductor supplies. Like we we already have issues. They have with rare earths and other things. They threatened us with that. Cutting us off. They've cut Japan off in the past from critical metals for I don't know a month or two during their spat on some islands or something, territorial spat before. So China, they don't want to lose our business, but at the same time, I think they're playing a game here where they're hurting themselves, but they can hurt us more, and we're vulnerable. And doing another round of these lockdowns right now, another big supply issues as we've overstimulated the economy, and we're going into a recession. Cycles are off. I mean, boy, we're vulnerable. I don't like that. I don't like the position where the U.S. is right now, and it's just like the rest of the world. They've seen how we've acted in the past, as I was saying, last 20 some years, 30 years. They're just ready. There's a lot of adversaries and this competitiveness. They want retribution, and just unfortunately, I think Americans don't realize there's a lot of that out there, and China is one of them. And I do not believe this is some accidental policy that they're so worried about COVID. We know what the data is. You're gonna have to have a no zero policy at some point, and they'll do that. But for now, they're using it to their advantage, I believe.
And it's a dangerous situation. And you mentioned that when Napoleon entered into Russia, that they were essentially willing to burn Moscow down in order to save themselves. It seems like almost the U.S. might be in that sort of situation with their policy in, uh, I guess, really Central Europe right now, Eastern Europe right now, excuse me, and then also Ukraine and Russia. And as if they would, and this is their policy, I believe, would absorb a nuclear strike as to take a hit in order to kind of play this in a certain way. I just have, I guess, feelings mostly, but that's actually not just a feeling. That is actually I believe our policy is to make sure 100% certain through a detonation that a nuclear bomb has been fired upon, I guess, our homeland, or I guess a home front is the, I guess, military word. So now I mentioned Chamberlain and what some critics have said was a mistake by appeasing Germany and Hitler in the lead up to World War II, suggesting that it led ultimately to the wider conflict. And therefore, this is why you must be now very steadfast in your support of Ukraine with like ammunition, munitions, javelin missiles, etc. Um, Noam Chomsky has stated that yes, there is a certain level of support which makes sense in order to allow the Ukrainians to defend themselves. But he says that it's a very fine balance about how much. You don't want to do too much. I suppose you don't want to do too little. That's essentially Chomsky's argument at this point, who
Mm-hmm.
but I might not agree with on economic, economic front, but it seems like he has very interesting insights on the foreign policy front. Now, staving off like a World War III situation, in my opinion, I essentially believe entails economic concerns. And this would have gone for both Putin and the West at this point. It's about building up your own economies. If Putin really wanted to kind of stave off a NATO expansion, I think the first steps would have been to build up an independent economic infrastructure, financial infrastructure in Russia, either and keep it either in beta or roll it out over time. Probably roll it out over time. And and the first thing that comes to mind is something like a central bank digital currency. That's the second thing that comes to mind. The first thing is, of course, sensible economic policies, allowing small businesses to thrive, allowing business to thrive, generally trade internationally. So lowering sanctions or lowering tariffs. Same for the West. Now, it seems the opposite is going on. We've just are printing money. We're just sending money overseas. We're just printing money. We like first printed money and then sent it to citizens in the United States, and now we're just doing it again and sending it to the world, which only will increase inflation. Of course, the sanctions also have had a boomerang effect and increased inflation as well, harming the global economy overall. Um, Now it seems we've done the exact opposite. And you're now, Peter, when you think about like solutions, if you were a statesman in a important position, policy advisor, something like that, like what options do you see on the table for the West, and not only the West, but I guess sanity?
Yeah, I think for the West, you got to make some hard decisions, and you got to take some pain before you can, put your house in order. The government is employing millions of people, tens of millions of people. We have a labor shortage. We have a government that's running huge deficits. So you got to fix that. So you got to reduce the size of government tremendously. You got to, you got to cut taxes tremendously. You got to, at the same time, cut government spending. You've got to promote an economy that's not just built around a military industrial complex, around financial services, around consumption. You can't be promoting overconsumption, and that's been a big influence with central banks by mismanagement of allocation of capital. They've cut rates so much, so they disincentivize capital savings. We've promoted a casino-like atmosphere in the markets, so everyone's been speculating, and you've thrown money into different bubbles, and everything of the whole economy is mismanaged. So you have to get the checks and balances back into place. And we got to look at our roots, our constitutional republic. There was a reason why they talked about gold and silver as money in the Constitution. It's more, it's about checks and balances, because without any restraint, the government just strays away from what its limits should be, and it just grows grotesquely large, and with the ability to print money and endlessly, it seems seemingly endlessly. There is a limit. It'll eventually end horribly, but as an empire, you can get away with it while, for a while longer. But they're just throwing money all around the world. And yeah, it's just you have to focus on your internal problems. You had to fix the issues, and there's a lot of issues in the United States, and not all of it's financial. There's division between classes, and how was that promoted through the Federal Reserve and the government, all so on. But there's class division, but there's social issues. There's a real mental crisis and cultural. There's just social issues. So there's a lot that the United States needs to deal with, and it's a hard thing. And I think a lot of it is influenced by how our behavior is. A lot of the behavior comes from the central planning. So there are some things that could be quickly done, but yeah, there's no easy way out of it. That's the thing. And no one wants to take any, pain, just like, how can we avoid things? How can we, patch it, and that's a horrible mentality.
An oligarchy controls the media in the US and across the planet. The same kind of programming that's been fed to the US citizenry over decades now has been also exported, and increasingly so, I think, with the advent of the internet in many ways, which is how big these media conglomerations are. And you mentioned quick solutions. Perhaps the quick solution lies in the FCC. I wonder. They do have quite a bit of power.
Yes.
And I think actually a lot of the examples, now this is dangerous recommend solution to say, oh, well, more government could be a solution, but I'm trying to think from like practical, positioning here. Like if I woke up president one day, I probably, as Thoreau said, like, I asked not for no government at once, just better government. But with the FCC, a lot of the precedent was sent through fights with Howard Stern, interestingly enough. Now, at GoldSilverBitcoin, let's turn our attention towards the metals right now. Gold looks to benefit from essentially all of the geopolitical macroeconomic trends, as it has for some time now, albeit slowly and quietly. Silver is a much more, I think, complex, is priced in it's based on more factors, and therefore its behavior over the last decades has been, I think, a little bit more unpredictable. It's still at $25. There's a headline today at silverseek.com: inflation is killing silver. What are your thoughts, Peter, on silver generally right now?
Well, the quick thing on the media side, that was under Clinton, I believe, that whole the law that allowed these huge conglomerates, media conglomerates, to happen, and the small media died off. That's very unfortunate, which was the same time I started GoldSeek and SilverSeek. But that was also because there was very little attention to the way of thinking, which I think you think, and a lot of us in the gold silver world and crypto world think, which is that the governments have been behaving recklessly, and it's not allowed to be discussed on the mainstream media. That where the source of, say, inflation is coming from. It's disgusting to hear these politicians say greedy corporations, greedy this, greedy that. Where the source of inflation is purely monetarily, from the central banks. It comes, they've expanded the money supply, and no scrutiny ever comes down to them. And that's the problem. We don't have the open discussion. The media, like I said, it's closed off. So, SilverSeek, GoldSeek, we started a platform where various opinions that have good arguments, analysis can submit, and have a platform to share that. And CNBC and these guys, they mocked at the idea of gold in '95, late '90s, when I started getting into all this as a teenager. It was a joke. It was a barbaric metal. These PhDs have figured out this brilliant new financial system, and we're civilized. We're civilized people. Well, that we've proven that to be untrue. Human nature has taken over once again, and we're in record setting, never created before, debt, leverage, just misallocation. The whole system's never, it's so messed up. So, and talk about that. It's necessary to have these different platforms. So it is great to see the internet provide us with this ability to talk about ways to protect ourselves. And I believe gold has been an excellent way to do that over time, even though it can be highly disconnected from reality. You saw the gold price just it go from some extremes from 850 in 1980 down to 250 to 2000, 1000, and so on. And a lot of it's driven by these paper markets. Things overshoot on both sides of the market. A lot of speculators, and then you have the addition of some very highly concentrated players, especially in the silver market. There's some really highly concentrated short positions, and I don't, I think in the short term, trying to trade that is viciously dangerous. It just swings back and forth. You have different factors that in play as well. Like you mentioned, it's more complex. China being shut down is just horrible for commodities right now. And then there's a greater threat of, as you mentioned, the headline, inflation going up means that they're going to raise rates more aggressively, which makes people want to sell off. They think, there's going to be less inflation down the road. Higher rates is anti, it goes against ownership of gold and silver. But it's also false because, we've lived in our lifetimes in the greatest bond market rally in our lifetimes. The rates went down to nearly zero, and we've created an empire of debt, as they say. We have finance a huge amount of our debt near 0%, and we continue to run deficits. We're so leveraged up, and so on, so on. So at some point, this will be reflected through the value of the fiat currencies, which we'll start to see collapsing. And that said, I do believe in the argument and believe, and I've said this for about 15, 20 years, that the final act will be a rush into the US dollar, and the herd will go into there for perceived safety because it's the king fiat. And it is still needed. When there is a liquidity shortage, you still need the dollars because all this debt is dollar debt. And when the system starts to collapse and there's not a lot of money around, actually the value of the dollar might spike up. And that's right before, have its final act where they'll print the living heck out of it. So it's kind of hard to see where the path is in the near term if they're going to have a spout where they try to pull into deflation. But the inflation is so embedded in the system, and there is so much money still floating out there. The Fed and central banks around the world still are mostly scared of deflation. So they're more okay with allowing this inflation to run above their 2% targets. They just don't want it to get too high. So I think we'll see what happens. They're trying to kind of let the steam out of these bubbles and see if they can bring down the inflation rate, if they can, keep it below the official quote unquote 10%, 8-9% inflation rate. They'll bring that down to 5-6%. So meaning the real inflation rate might be 10%. To them that's going to be okay. They'll let that run. But you can really raise rates too aggressively and spark a deflationary crash too. So it's kind of a catch-22. So it's really dangerous position for them and very difficult for them to navigate this.
You mentioned something that I've been meaning to dig in deeper to, deflation in general. Now, I think that this is an underestimated threat by my estimation completely. We are complaining about a little bit of inflation, but I guess we should all be happy that we at least have money to buy things at this point. So deflation in a deflationary scenario, that might not be the case. Can you explain the deflationary threat and perhaps proceed it with what deflation is as well?
Sure. Well, debt is inherently deflationary. So debt either has to be repaid back. And as we've seen with the government and general, debt levels continue to grow and grow and grow. So it's not getting paid, it just continues to grow, especially as rates go to zero or very low rates. They promoted this massive credit debt bubble. And to solve that, you either have to repay it back, which it won't be repaid because it's unpayable at these levels. Unpayable amount of debt exists. So you either have to monetize it, which is printing, which we've seen some of that, which is Federal Reserve printing money and buying treasuries or mortgage-backed securities or assets. Or in Japan, they've been buying stocks like crazy for decades. They've been doing quantitative easing to infinity there. And they can't get out of deflation. But yeah, deflation is a real drag. It's the biggest threat and fear that central banks have, because once that gets embedded, like in the Great Depression crash, that was deflationary. That goes beyond their control. So the central bank has been established on the basis of always promoting a certain level of inflation. but it never, it just doesn't ever pay back the debt. They want to try to manage the debt levels, but it never gets paid back. So deflation, yeah, it's always a big issue out there. How does it get paid back? And it's not hard. Greenspan says we'll never have a true deflationary crash again. We'll never default on our debts because we have printing presses. So central banks, in the end, are most fearful of deflation. In the second deflation or deflationary energy or pool start to, debt collapsing, they'll start to pump on liquidity again. So now the question is how high will they let the rates go before they increase these threats of debt collapse? And that's probably not too high. And then yeah, letting debt collapse, it cascades everything. It just implodes everything. Liquidity dries up. Banks don't trust each other. No lending happens. It just the whole system, the credit system, everything just freezes. So it's like Lehman Brothers. It just starts collapsing, and now it's just at such a high leverage rate. And again, if anyone understands this better, it's probably our adversaries. And that's why, again, going back to say Russia and China, they see our vulnerabilities here. And what do you do now? You're at 0% rates. They're trying to raise it before the next recession, but we're heading into next recession. So, all they can do right now is just buy time before this issue just comes to a head. And there's talk of a great reset, or there's something where we're gonna wake up one day like in 1933, or when Roosevelt delinked gold from the dollar and revalued the dollar. Basically, they're gonna have to revalue the dollar, do something. So there's different things that can happen, but right now the Fed, their goal is to not allow deflation pull in. They'll still promote inflation. They'll say they're attacking inflation, but we know that the worst thing they can do is actually collapse inflation to zero or below.
I think that there's two tales about the Weimar Republic monetary history, and one is that highlights, of course, the pictures of wheelbarrows of money and the hyperinflation. But there's another version that argues that the hyperinflation actually ended 10 years before 1933, when Hitler came to power, and more recently, Germany had suffered deflation. So, for instance, this is a paper. I'll tell you who wrote this after I read this quote I found in it. Now, the Nazis took over more than 10 years after the hyperinflation had ended. The mass poverty that Rainer Brutal alludes to was not the outcome of hyperinflation, but rather the byproduct of massive unemployment, deep recession, and falling prices during the Great Depression of the early 1930s. Hitler came to power after a period of deflation. Now, I guess the way you presented that, you see it that the deflation was a result of inflation and hyperinflation, correct?
I wish I had this chart. I've looked at the chart maybe 10, 15 years ago, but during this period, there was it cycled from deflation to inflation, hyperinflation, and it went back and forth. So it wasn't actually just it just went into hyperinflation. It was going back and forth. It wasn't just constant. It was unpayable amount of debts from World War I that they were trapped in, and it was an impossible, ability to pay it back. And yeah, the images of central bank wheelbarrow money come at the front, but there was there was some serious deflation as well. So it was a wild ride, and that could be a similar experience Weimar, where it is kind of central bank that reacts to the deflation pulling in, has to overreact or react in a bazooka style fashion again, where they do that. So they do that, and all of a sudden again, and inflation takes off and things start to get out of hand. So they have to cut the liquidity off and then try to pull the inflation back, but pulls back into deflation. So how they actually manage that is very, very difficult, and it's a lot of it is I think they'll have to institute more capital controls and different things down the road to prevent people from running out, taking money bank runs. And the deflationary crash in the 30s was a result of a bank run. They didn't have the FDIC back then, which was created after this, which may have stopped a run on the banks. But yeah, it is in a way, there's different styles out there, and I think that's actually a pretty good example that it isn't such a, in this case, it may not just be inflation. It's going to go through these cycles, and the central banks will react very aggressively on deflationary pullbacks.
That paper was Misremembering Weimar. It seems to be a policy paper on why we should all stop worrying and learn to love quantitative easing for the ECB. Peter, last question. Bitcoin now below 30,000. I separate that from crypto. So two questions really. Bitcoin, what's your outlook? But I want to hear your outlook on crypto in as succinct a manner as you can get out.
Mm-hmm. I think I need to first state that I entered Bitcoin and crypto at a early period. A lot of the gold and silver crowd went into it, and I'm thankful for Trace Mayer for introducing me at a GATA conference in 2011. And I became a very active supporter of Bitcoin. I lived in a kind of a Bitcoin crypto ecosystem in 2015 here in Prague, 2015-16, and I did stray away from precious metals. It was during this consolidation period, and it just yeah, it wasn't its time. And crypto was very interesting. I love the idea of the networks, independent networks away from, say, the SWIFT system where these central authorities have permission over us. I used Bitcoin on a daily basis in this ecosystem back then. It worked quite well. And then the bubble came, the first big one. Well, I would call it a real big one back in 17, 18. And at that point, I invested a lot into altcoin projects. Unfortunately, I had a lot of Bitcoins. I put a lot of that into precious metals and mining stocks at the time, but I also went into altcoins. So I learned a pretty difficult lesson about how those work. A lot of mismanagement in the crypto altcoin area. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad characters, and then there's a lot of good people, but not with the right experience or with ideas that just are they're not real true businesses. But yeah, there was the big crash back then, which resembles what's happening again right now. We went through a huge cycle, I believe it's the bubble, the easy money that the Fed created, central banks that was floating around, this speculative casino kind of atmosphere in all different markets really expressed itself well in the crypto markets. And you saw a lot of the Wall Street kind of guys. I don't have nice words for a lot of them, so I won't say that now, but they got involved and started pumping it, from Saylor and Silbert and these guys, and they did well. They were dumping their insider sales on the MSTR. It's been crazy, and it got so far away from that original community and roots that I didn't want to be part of it. I didn't get pulled back into it. And I also had the last, altcoin projects, none of them really revived in this thing. So I just kind of said, I understand precious metals. I like investing in things that I understand very well. And mining, it's, you're mining precious metals. There's a lot of high risk reward there already, and the sector is really being down. So I fully just stuck back to precious metals. I didn't ride this bubble higher, but I was pretty vocal that this is not going to last. And I think that deleveraging is happening now, and a lot of, there's some other issues with Tether potentially there, and other fraudulent exchanges like we saw last time. Those things start to show itself. So I think it's a bit of a dangerous period. There's going to be some big bounce rallies. You see some huge rallies in bear markets. I just would, again, caution traders, don't rush into stuff. It's better to wait for big pullbacks. But I still don't find it that attractive. I think Bitcoin has still got a lot more down to go. There's a lot of big holders out there, like MicroStrategies and retail guys who will need money. And in a bear market, like I saw, in gold and silver, it can last for years. It happened in crypto before. It's just the crypto winter, like it's 2017, 18. It just seemed like it could never ever revive, and it did. But there's gonna be there was just so much speculation, ridiculousness, and this easy money being made. Too much focus was being made on how much money was being made instead of the fundamentals and the projects and promoting its use. And I think that's what's needed. So it might be a good thing for the community. You get a pullback, and then the core people will start to focus more now on building those things. And we've all had our focus so much on these markets. It's a real big problem. Even for our economy and our culture, we're just so addicted to watching these prices, the volatility, and this casino atmosphere. Turns us from investors into speculators, and that's not good. So again, yeah, crypto, I find it very difficult. Bitcoin is yeah, I don't look at it as money, but I do believe it's an established network. It has its main function, especially with capital controls. I think that has a use there, but I still don't see the use growing enough for it happening yet for it to justify the valuation. So I continue to watch it, and maybe actually if it comes down far enough and stabilizes and I see some fundamental changes, I might get more interested in it. But I just think it's turned into a casino like a lot of markets.
And we've had experts predict $3,000 Bitcoin here, and it looks like we're heading in that direction potentially. But they also, I think, say the probability is higher around 20K. We have had the honor of sitting down today with Peter Spina. He founded goldseek.com, silverseek.com. You can find him on Twitter at twitter.com/goldseek. Is there anywhere else people can find you, Peter?
Those are the main places. I pretty much spend 99% of my social media time on Twitter. So yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate the conversation and being able to share some thoughts. And I think it's this is a very interesting moment in time, and we're all trying to figure out how this plays out. But it's a good time to take some protection on your side and having some liquidity, and try to get rid of unnecessary debts and pull back consumption right now. Focusing on savings, it's a good thing, and I think that's maybe the upside. I having relatives come from a former communist country, I look back at my grandmother here, and a lot of us can look at our grandparents, great grandparents who went through difficult times. They really can teach us what's important, and there's too much of a culture of consumption and not valuing things properly. So I hopefully, we've been focusing a lot on these kind of depressing topics, but there's a lot of good things happening too, and there's cycles and things will get better again. But yeah, especially for kind of younger generations, we got to look out for ourselves. We have governments who have been spending recklessly and doing some crazy things, and we, in the end, we have to help each other and take care of ourselves and be more prudent and have better self-responsibility than our leaders are acting at the moment.
As David Morgan says, America might just get thinner. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and have a great day.